Now, Southern African heads of state will gather in Namibia this week to celebrate a centenary year for the Southern African Customs Union. It's considered by the United States a world leader in demonstrating the power of regional integration and cross-border trade in advancing economic growth and development. The theme for this year will be implementing a common agenda towards regional integration here in Southern Africa. Joining us now on 100 Years of SACU is Dr Brendan Vickers from the Institute for Global Dialogue. Brendan, thank you very much for coming through. SACU, probably the oldest regional body the world over. Has integration worked well?
I think, over the years, since it's been formed, it's celebrating 100 years, there has been greater integration between South Africa and the partners, trade and investment. But I think the celebrations take place with quite a cloud of controversy and uncertainty about the future of the customs union. If one looks at all the divisions that have that emerged over the past few years around equitable sharing of revenue, differences over trade and industrial policy shown up by the economic partnership agreements, expansion. There's some speculation that South Africa actually wants to downgrade SACU from a customs union to a free trade agreement, strengthen relations with Namibia and Angola at the expense of the smaller countries. So it's serious questions that need to be addressed.
Okay, let's chip away at them in small blocks. The agenda is a common agenda, so looking for convergence. And there is a heavy focus on a harmonized industrial policy amongst SACU states. Now, how feasible is that when you consider that South Africa has just released a new industrial program? There's still going to be heavy protection of the automotive and textile industries, manufacturing going to get a big boost from government. And because of that, any imports coming into South Africa are heavily levied and taxed. Yes, it feeds back into the SACU revenue stream, but there isn't a case for South Africa to open up its economy. What about the rest of them?
I think it's quite problematic, the whole idea of harmonizing industrial policy in the region, because of the very different levels of development. We have South Africa, which is essentially a large developing economy, and we have least developed countries on the margins and small vulnerable countries like Botswana and Namibia. I think that also the whole question of what do they mean by harmonization? What is the definition of industrial policy and what is the content? And I think they're very different, important differences. South Africa, as you said, has developed an activist industrial policy, did this without really consulting its smaller neighbors. Smaller countries are import dependent. They want to get lowest cost goods into their economies to spur competitiveness, like Botswana. Many of the smaller countries like Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, they locked into South Africa's high growth cost model. So they import high cost services from South Africa, and as we know, these demonstrate oligopolistic characteristics. So there's a difference between South Africa that's on a protectionist path, the others that are on a liberalization path, and I think there's the challenge between the two.
Okay, they're also talking about the need to converge on trade policy, and not all SACU member states are as vulnerable to the hegemony of South Africa as others. Botswana, for instance, has been a firm proponent of economic partnership agreements with Europe when South Africa has argued against it, and consequently some of the smaller countries like Swaziland and Lesotho haven't known which way to go on this one.
I think that's the whole paradox. Essentially, as a customs union, we do share a common external tariff. But that's where the difficulties are. I think also going forward, it's the whole new generation trade agenda when it comes to investment, competition, services, and there are serious differences between the two countries, between the countries in the customs union. What we've also seen is this playing itself in international trade negotiations, when it comes to our preferential trade negotiations with India or with China, for instance. There are differences over what sectors of interest are for these countries. Also, how business interests in these smaller countries actually get their voice onto the agenda that is essentially driven by South Africa.
Well, how are unfair trading practices dealt with within the SACU Charter? There's been a lot of talk to review annexures of the Article 40 that deals specifically with trade issues.
Well, I think the biggest challenge which heads of state are going to have to address is the institutionalization of SACU. What's quite novel about the new agreement is a range of new institutions that are envisaged, one being the Tariff Board. So South Africa, which has long called the shots, actually cedes sovereignty over its trade policy and over the region to the collective. The point is that all of the smaller member states need to develop their own domestic institutions first, which will feed up to the supranational institution. So far, those haven't been established. It's only South Africa's International Trade Commission that's working.
Although it's a customs union, it does tend to operate as a monetary union. Botswana's currency is pegged to the rand, and basically all trade happens in South African rands.
That's right. I think that's a measure of the level of integration, economic integration between the countries. I think it's important to bear in mind that countries like Swaziland and Lesotho, they're small economies. So, what it does do, it does reduce transaction costs, but certainly, these smaller countries lose sovereignty over their monetary policy, over the ability to respond to domestic and external crises. But I think, in the long run, if one looks at the levels of integration, that's probably a good thing for business.
Right. Okay, let's talk about levels of integration and bring you into this one, Chris Hart. South Africa, the bully in the neighborhood, often seen protecting its economies.
Exactly. I think up until, you could say, a year or two, even 3 years ago, South Africa was, the relationships have always been asymmetric. I wouldn't use the term bully necessarily, okay, in the sense, but there has been a benevolence from South Africa in actual fact, because when one looks at it, and the amount of transfers that are paid over to these countries, as a proportion even of South African GDP, one would say South Africa is the biggest donor country as a proportion of GDP, certainly to its neighbours. But of course you don't want your neighbours just living off charity, and it becomes a burden on South Africa. And South Africa's, in the last 2 or 3 years specifically, well, that's my observation anyway, has become a lot more how can I say, internally focused. In other words, to almost say, this is our policy, the others be damned. And that's the tension. In other words, the negotiations with Europe, for instance, it's the other countries have now tried to break away from the South African approach, which is very, very own interest orientated.
And just a final input, just on the back of what Chris is saying. When Pravin Gordhan released his budget earlier on this year, there were calls for him to withdraw contributions to SACU or reduce them, because effectively South Africa is feeding about 20 billion rands into SACU coffers, and then the distribution happens accordingly. And there is a view that with a budget deficit at about 7% in this country, needing to rein in spending, a lot of the revenues that go to SACU could be coming in for developmental projects in South Africa, and there is a strong case for South Africa to renegotiate its position within SACU purely because of its own developmental needs.
I think that's true. I think the National Treasury is actually looking at reviewing the revenue sharing formula, but I think the big thing for South Africa perhaps is introducing greater transparency into how this money is used. The alternative is perhaps to pool those funds into a regional development fund, which will go to financing cross-border infrastructure, for instance, trade facilitation needs, rather than providing direct budget support. I think that's the biggest challenge for SACU, to conclude with, is that we have to move beyond a customs union based on revenue sharing, a regional cash machine, and one that actually goes into the deeper integration agenda if we are going to be relevant and meaningful for the 21st century.
How relevant and meaningful is SACU going to be in the next 100 years?
The next 100 years, I think unless we start integrating as a region, developing these common policies, using our leverage as a bigger market on the international negotiating stage, I don't think much. The problem is, it's a historical accident, and we have smaller countries dependent on us. And in terms of regional integration for South Africa, it is important to keep SACU alive.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Brendan Vickers from the Institute of Global Dialogue.